Shalom and welcome to our newest podcast series, Good for the Jews, Inside Christian Zionism. These 6 episodes are unlike any podcast that we've ever done before. Each episode will feature a prominent Jewish voice and the voice of a prominent Christian Zionist. And we'll take a deep look into one of the most important and often misunderstood relationships today. That of the Jewish community and the evangelical Christians who stand with us. I'm Yael Eckstein, President and CEO of the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews.
And I'm Zvika Klein, Editor-in-Chief of the Jerusalem Post.
We've discussed the overwhelming Christian support for Israel and the Jewish people that we see today, and we're going to give you a behind-the-scenes look into this historic relationship that everyone wants to know more about. We are going to answer that question and leave it to you to answer as well. Is it good for the Jews? Stay tuned. Today, we're joined by a true Christian friend of Israel, Pastor Alan Jackson. Pastor Jackson leads World Outreach Church in Tennessee, serving more than 15,000 people through outreach activities, community events, and worship services. With Alan Jackson Ministries, he also reaches over 3 million people each week around the world through his messaging. Central to Pastor Jackson's message is his love for Israel and the Jewish people. Having long been a friend of both, in the months since October 7th attacks, he has helped fight growing anti-Semitism that we see while also spreading the truth about Israel.
Yeah, Yael, you showed me pictures from your visit to his church, and I thought it was so surprising and beautiful to see, the flags, and also it was just interesting to see how big it is.
Yeah, these mega churches in America are huge, and that means that the pastor has so much ability to shift opinion. And there are too many pastors who don't want to talk about Israel because it's too divisive, because they'll get too much pushback. And so what was so inspiring for me was someone like Pastor Jackson, who has so much influence and reaches so many people. He never apologizes about standing with Israel.
Definitely. I mean, I think if you had so many flags of Israel outside, I think that definitely says where your heart is and what you think, and regardless of what people are going to say about you, right?
100%. Okay, let's hear from him directly.
Yep.
Pastor Alan, I am so excited that we have this last episode of the podcast featuring you. We're actually originally only going to do 5 episodes, and we added 1 extra one because I thought it was so important that the world hear your voice when it comes to Christian support for Israel and fighting against anti-Semitism. And the reason why this was so important for me is because I had a life-changing experience when I came to your church. It's a church in the middle of Nashville that's more like a huge auditorium that you manage to fill every Sunday and many other times during the week. And when I drove up to the church, there were 1,200 tiny Israeli flags, not so tiny, small Israeli flags planted on the church grounds. The outside wall of this huge auditorium of the church said, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem." And there was a mural of the Western Wall there. And as I walked through the church, the entire lobby was filled with scripture of "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem," the history of anti-Semitism, including the church and anti-Semitism, showing how tiny Israel is compared to its neighbors. So, Pastor Alan, let's start with how this deep love and commitment to be a voice for Israel started, and what really drove you to take such a leading, unapologetic role in your church that, especially this past, could be controversial to stand for Israel.
Well, first of all, Yael, it's an honor to be with you and Zvika today. I thank you for the time, and it's a privilege to stand with you. I really think probably that's the answer to your question starts with my parents. It's really, I'm standing on the shoulders of others. They brought me to Israel the first time when I was a boy. And I remember walking down King George Street in Jerusalem. It was a tour of Christians, and the man that was leading the tour was Derek Prince. And he began teaching me the Hebrew alphabet from the signs on King George Street. And so I thought that was normal. I thought all little boys learned to love the Jewish people. And I just continued. I studied at Hebrew University. I have been in and out of the land my whole life, and consider one of the greatest honors of my life the privilege of standing with the Jewish people. You know, I can tell you the change that took place. I think Christians come to Israel. I brought hundreds of tours. Christians come because they want to see the holy sites.
Yeah.
But I think the real progression in that journey is it's not the rocks. They learn to love the people of the land. Mm. And then that transcends just the boundaries of Israel. And they recognize that we stand with our Jewish brothers and sisters throughout the earth. And I love being a part of watching that happen in the lives of people. And so that's the reason I'm still bringing tours. It's not because I've seen the sites, but I love watching that transformation that comes in the lives of people.
It's actually interesting, years ago when I was straight out of the Army, even before I was in the Army, I think, I was a counselor on Birthright, Birthright Israel. And I also really enjoyed people going through a process of, what they were going to see. And you kind of know the places where potentially people will go through some sort of a transformative experience. What are those sites when you come to visit?
Well, I think it's kind of twofold. There's some places they're familiar with from the stories of Scripture, like the Mount of Beatitudes in Galilee. Galilee still feels more biblical because it's not quite as crowded. When you get to Jerusalem and, there's 28 layers of archaeology, it's a little more complex. The biblical sites work, but it's really the integration with the people of the land that I think brings the changes.
And how many times have you been to Israel?
Oh, I've lost count. I mean, it's dozens and dozens and dozens. And I mean, literally, I've been coming and going since I was 11 years old, and I'm well past 11 years old.
And October 7th did not stop you. I know we were together in Jerusalem not long after October 7th, which for me to see Pastor Allen and his incredible wife sitting in Jerusalem as Israel was being bombarded by rockets was the strongest sign of practical solidarity. And I'm wondering, Pastor Allen, have you gotten any pushback for your strong support for Israel? Do you feel like as a leader of a church, people don't come to your church because you stand with Israel? Or have you heard people from your congregation tell you to tone it down or to have an issue with Israel that they think you shouldn't be so strong and vocal in standing with Israel, especially as we've seen rise in anti-Semitism since October 7th? Do you see that happening in the church?
Sure. I think anytime you take a stand for what's right, not everybody's going to cheer. And not everybody appreciates, our attitude towards Israel and the Jewish people. But, I just had a meeting with the man who sent me a text, a pretty prominent person. And he said, he didn't understand my position and we needed to unpack it. And so I'm looking forward to doing that in some more detail with him. But I have to say, truthfully, I think in most cases, it's just ignorance. Because when people have an opportunity to hear the facts, to understand the details, I find most people are not really that resistant. The anti-Semitism at our formerly elite universities, I refuse to call them elite any longer. They're propaganda centers. They're not educating students. It's embarrassing to see what is happening on those campuses. And when you listen to interviews with the protesters, most of them are ignorant. And I hold the faculty and the administrations responsible at those universities. But, at the local level and the local congregation, I find overwhelmingly people want to know. And if you will help them, I'm amazed. We have hundreds and hundreds. I could stop and be a full-time tour guide. I have enough people saying, we would like to do this with you. But I have a day job, so I have to limit those opportunities.
I actually interviewed someone a few days ago who also an evangelical pastor, and he told me for many evangelicals, Israel is like Narnia until they, before they come to Israel, right? It's kind of something that is like this, biblical, historic land, and they could imagine it the way they want to imagine it. And then when they come to Israel, like it actually becomes real and a lot more, complex. I'm wondering if you've seen that with your congregants or as a tour guide, right? Now you're almost a full-time tour guide. But when you come to Israel, like, how does that, come through with your congregants?
Well, I think your observation is precise. I think a lot of Christians, and I think a lot of them have been coached to that the Bible and those narratives kind of live in a mythical form. It's like long, long ago and far, far away, or once upon a time. Yeah. And when they come to Israel and they realize that there's actual physical places that correspond with that. But I also, in just watching and listening with my Israeli friends, I think I have a bit of jealousy. There's as much diversity within the Jewish community as there is within the Christian community, which I think is probably healthy. But even amongst my secular Israeli friends, Jeremiah is not a fictional character. He's like their great uncle Jeremiah. And you have a connection with the land and the narrative that Christians do not have, because they come to it primarily, or at least initially, through literature. And that's unfortunate, because I think there's a strength that you have that comes from that just candid acceptance of the narrative. It's your story. And most Christians don't understand it that way. And that's why I think there's a tremendous strength if they can learn to be appreciative of the Jewish people, that we stand together, that there's far more things that bind us together than things that would push us apart. And if they can grasp that, then we truly are united. There are things we can disagree on, but we're united in our story together. And that's really a powerful force in the world.
It's really powerful what you're saying, Pastor Allen, for so many reasons. First of all, I think about that often, how even for the Jewish people, Israel used to be, like what Zvika said, I love that, Narnia, someplace we spoke about and we said at the end of the Passover Seder next year in Jerusalem, and we prayed physically facing Jerusalem. But after 2,000 years of exile, I often think about my grandfather, who was born in Germany, who all of his family was killed in Auschwitz. And I imagine him running from the Nazis and hiding and, opening up his Bible and reading like, one day the Jewish people will return to Israel, and be like, really? How do you hold on to that faith? It's Narnia. Like is it theoretical? Is it poetic? And it's incredible that we live in this generation now that it's just a given. Zvika sitting in Jerusalem. I'm sitting, close to Caesarea. All of these towns that we learn about that used to be some mythical place are actual physical locations. And it's the land that holds the holiness just as much as it's the people who hold the holiness. And so I think by having Jews settled here, and of course protecting the Christian community, and in Nazareth the fellowship is very active, and in Jerusalem, and we built a hospital in Nazareth, and caring for the Christian community, and needing to settle this land, all of God's children together in freedom and unity together. And that's what brings the holiness back to the land, which is something that's such a powerful statement. And when you say that we have to focus on what we have in common more than what we have, for 2,000 years, we focused, Jews and Christians, on what separates us. And now as a generation, we're learning we have to focus on what ties us together. We're tied together in the positive, in the sanctity of life, of these Judeo-Christian values, of family values, of children, of intergenerational education in the Bible. But we're also tied together in a very difficult shared destiny. Here in the Middle East, we've seen the Christian population be decimated, be wiped out almost. Here in neighboring Syria, just recently having over 400 Christians killed in a 2-day span is something that's unfathomable. And I think Israel's doing everything it can to speak out and be the voice for those persecuted Christians and provide protection when they're able. But I'm wondering, Pastor Allen, what are areas that you see kind of the shared destiny of the Jews and Christians today? And do you think anti-Semitism, for example, will stop with the Jews, or it's something that the Christians should worry about as well?
That's such a good question. There's a phrase that Paul repeats in the book of Romans several times: to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. And I've come to understand that as a way for me to learn. I watch what happens to the Jewish community, and I imagine that I will see expressions of something similar to the Christian community. And I'm a student of history, so I'm somewhat familiar with anti-Semitism through the generations and its many expressions. So it shouldn't be surprising to me that it's continuing today at Columbia University or Harvard or MIT. but it is. And I also think that the hatred of Christians is growing in the earth. And I think we see expressions of that. And while it surprises me, I know it shouldn't. I think behind anti-Semitism is something that's more powerful than politics or empires. I think there's a spirit behind it. And I think that same spirit hates all the people of the book. And so I don't know if it's offensive to you or not, honestly, but I think anti-Semitism and the hatred of people who believe the New Testament are driven by a very similar spirit, because they hate the purposes of God in the earth. And I think that's one of the ways that we have to stand together. It's one of the reasons I'm determined I don't want to just be your friends when tourism is good. I'm honored to be your friend when no one's coming, because we have to give the message to the world that we will not be separated by pressure or hatred or divisiveness. That while we may not agree on everything, there are many things we do agree on, and we truly do need one another.
Pastor, you mentioned a lot of issues regarding Israel, and I'm wondering, with this current administration, largely supported by evangelical Christians, obviously, not only, and I'm sure there are also evangelicals, some of them who are voted for other parties, but what do you think we should be expecting when it comes to the relations between Israel and the United States, but also maybe possibly the Abraham Accords and other interfaith relations?
Well, what I keep saying to the congregation and wherever is I think God is moving.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not trying to elevate President Trump to some unique status. I don't mean that at all. I just think the purposes of God have kind of broken loose. When I hear an American president say marriage is between a man and a woman, or there are only two sexes, there's a logic and a wisdom in that defies politics. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think of Mr. Trump a great deal like I think of Samson in the scripture. God used Samson to bring deliverance to the people, not because Samson's character was so stellar, and God gave him a strength that your enemies could not identify. He was unremarkable in appearance, but he was remarkable in his strength. And when I watched Mr. Trump during his first presidency with the Abraham Accords, it was most unexpected. I mean, we'd heard president after president, prattle on about what they wanted to do about the embassy, and they would move it, and then they didn't. And in about 6 months, President Trump did. And I was surprised again, but I knew when he said that the solutions in Gaza hadn't worked, we had to do something else. Once he stated that, it was so clear. I don't really think he wants to build a Trump Tower on the beach in Gaza, but I do think that he was changing the discussion. And I think he's going to change the discussion about the whole land. It would be foolish to do for 70 more years what you have done for the last 70 and continue to have the terror and the challenges that you faced. And I think God has used him. It's the most improbable scenario. I really can't explain it other than I believe in God. Because our nation is as polarized as Israel is polarized politically. We're hardly unified places. Mm-hmm. And yet we see the purposes of God emerging. And I just stand back and wonder and think, well, that's the truth. So I'll go stand next to that.
It's interesting because, I always think about how there's this stigma maybe that Christians are anti-Muslim or Islamophobic or don't like other people other than themselves or are warmongers. And it's so beautifully ironic. It's so kind of tangible and disproving that stigma that it's Christians who backed the Abraham Accords. I always think about this, that what I see in the many Christians that I speak to, they're very for freedom and diversity and for moving the the in a better way, but recognize who the victim is and who the oppressor is. And so there's this moral compass of, the people of the Middle East deserve to be free, which is why we're going to hate Hamas, which is why we're going to try to oust all these and isolate all these countries who stand with terror and embolden and empower those Muslim countries that stand for, like you said, we might have things the same, we might have things different, but stand for freedom partnering with those who value life instead of those who want to destroy life. And what I see in the Abraham Accords, and what I really hope for, is that so many of my Christian friends are behind Abraham Accords and are traveling to Arab and Muslim countries now, trying to get more people involved. And so I'm wondering, Pastor Allen, do you think that the Christian community would back President Trump in expanding the Abraham Accords to even more Muslim countries?
I don't imagine myself a prophet, but I would expect some very prominent voices in the Christian community to support Mr. Trump if those opportunities present themselves. Because I think there is a growing recognition that the patterns of the last years in the Middle East have not been supporting Iran, and seeing them gain more prominence is not bringing good things to the region or to the world. And I think from just a pragmatic standpoint, I think if there are any things we can do to help create harmony between those Muslim states and Israel, and include any of the Western nations that can be a part of that, I think that's a very good thing. And I think there are prominent leaders in the Christian community that will support that. I've already had some calls, people asking me to come with them from Christian leaders to come visit, biblical Samaria, and so that there can just start to be some visual evidence that that's a part of the story of Israel and that you shouldn't be separated from that part of your history, which I was encouraged. I thought that's great that there's others being willing now to tell that story.
So I'm wondering, you mentioned the issue of Judea and Samaria. I'm wondering what you yourself, but also, fellow leaders from your communities are trying to, I wouldn't use the word lobby, but trying to encourage this government to do with regard to Israel, with regard to the Middle East. Like what other, as Yael was saying, the evangelicals were pushing for the move of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And there was the encouraging to do the Abraham Accords, right? I mean, I've seen many articles with evangelical leaders trying to gather support for Israel to annex, I don't know if that's the right word, but to pretty much acknowledge Judea and Samaria as part of sovereign Israel. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, like what you have on the agenda.
I just want to add in from my experience of what I've seen and from what I've spoken to people on the ground, both working on potential Judea and Samaria policies and also Abraham Accords, what all of them told me, every single one of them had looked at me and said, Yael, we want to further what the Israeli people and government want to do. We don't have our own agenda here. If the Israeli government didn't want Judea and Samaria recognized, we wouldn't be pushing for it. And I think that's a really important point from my experience, because for me personally, if I felt like there were any outside people coming in with their own agenda that was against the will or desire or strategy of the Israeli government and people, I wouldn't feel good with that. But when there's something like the U.S. Embassy moving to Jerusalem, that now we just say it as if, oh, of course, but then they thought it might start World War III to be doing that. And what all of the people behind it said to me was, well, the Israeli government wants this. This is a priority, which is why we're doing it, not because of our own agenda. So I just wanted to kind of first, Pastor Allen, if you agree with that, but also just add in my experience to your question, Zvika.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zvika, it's a good question. And Yael, I couldn't agree with you more emphatically. And I could just speak for myself. I don't have any ambitions for Israel beyond what the citizens have for themselves. And what's valuable to me about a conversation like this, or the friendship that we have, is I listen. And because it's a complex thing, what happens in the midst of peoples and nations. And I don't open my Bible and imagine that I'm supposed to dictate from that what's going to happen in the land of Israel. And sometimes it's embarrassing. I have friends that live in Ma'ale Adumim, and when Bush was president and he put a moratorium on building in the settlements, and I was embarrassed. What business does my president have saying that somebody in a community outside of Jerusalem can't make an addition on their home? That's not our business. So I think we look to those of you that are our friends in Israel to help us understand what you feel is appropriate next. And then we do our best, or I want to do my best to use my influence and my voice to help move that forward. And I think in that we tell the truth about where we're godly and where we're ungodly. I expect you to do that with me, and I would hope you'd be receptive of that from me coming your way. Because at the end of the day, our strength isn't in our military or our politicians. Our strength is in the protection of God. Yes. And if we lose sight of that, we will forfeit our futures. But I don't imagine at all that we're dictating the agenda. I don't want to.
No, 100%. So can you tell me, like, what in your opinion are the main topics being promoted?
Well, I think the discussion has shifted dramatically. It wasn't too many years ago when I would visit the land, my liberal Israeli friends thought the Golan Heights should be given to Syria.
Right.
And clearly that narrative is unraveled, and I think everybody's grateful that the Golan belongs to Israel and has been recognized at least by the U.S. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not really surprised that the attitude towards Judea and Samaria is changing. The map, if you look at the map today, it looks like the pox with all these little dots and blotches, and it's unsustainable. But that's not for me to say it's unsustainable. I'm not living there all the time. Right. But if the people of the land come and say there has to be a better solution that will provide a more certain future for all the people, Jew and Arab and Druze and whomever else may be there, there's a logic in that I would absolutely support you in. And I think that narrative needs to be carried forward. And I think those changes, I've been surprised. I think those changes come far more quickly than I used to understand. I never imagined they'd move the embassy in 6 months.
Yeah, right.
The Abraham Accords could be assembled in less than a year.
Right.
Or that Gaza would all of a sudden, like, there's a whole new attitude towards Gaza. And I think correspondingly, I think there's a whole new attitude emerging towards Judea and Samaria. And so when I say God is moving, those are the things I mean, because we've heard these debates until we're all exhausted.
Yeah.
But now the narrative has changed. And so I will gladly use my voice to cooperate with that. It's a challenge in it. And I think you understand that better than anybody I know in the world. You live in a very difficult neighborhood, and freedom is not cheap. Mm-hmm. And doing the right thing is not simple, and there's always resistance. Right. And so I'm not particularly intimidated or daunted because there's resistance. I think we have a leader that's willing to do what seems to be the right thing to me. And I understand that to be a blessing from God. So I want to do everything I can to cooperate with that.
For me, what stands out so much is how educated so many Christians in America are on Israel, because I think that's what we need in order to fight anti-Semitism. So many people are ignorant. Like you said, Pastor Allen, you go to these protests on the college campuses, university campuses, and you ask the head of the protest who's most angry, like, who's the leader of the Palestinian Authority, or name one historic Palestinian figure, or which river and which sea. And they have no clue. What's the difference between Gaza and the West Bank? They don't know. And I think one of the reasons why we've been able to sustain Christian support for Israel is both biblical, but also because of leaders like you, Pastor Allen, who educate your people to understand what's happening. And so when we talk about even like what Zvika was talking about now, moving the Gaza population while Gaza's rebuilt, temporary, permanently, whatever it is, and the whole world has this outcry. Well, so many people recognize during the Syria war, there were 6 million refugees who left and were resettled in Europe and in Arab countries without even thinking twice, and there was no uproar. We're talking about 1.5, 2 million people who they're not peaceful people, even like Syria. You're talking about terrorists who are sworn to Israel's destruction and swear that they will never stop until Israel is destroyed. So I think so much is this basic understanding of world events through spiritual eyes. And I love how you said it, that you're not dictating your policy or political position based on the Bible, because we don't always know what God wants us to do at any moment in history. God changes things in order to open up opportunities at different times. But when you look at what's happening in the world and cross that with the Bible, you know how to be educated, how to stay on top of it, and when God's hand is moving. So I'm wondering, Pastor Allen, I know so many Christians that I speak to, on top of being educated and knowing politically what's happening in Israel and the Middle East, They also quote Genesis 12:3 as this perfect cross of kind of, I'm standing with Israel because Israel is a democracy and free and treats minorities well and has a right to be there and cherishes life and values life, but also because God tells me, because Genesis 12:3 says, I will bless those that bless Israel. So as the leader of one of the largest and one of the most prominently pro-Israel churches in America, have you seen this blessing of Genesis 12:3, the blessing of if you bless Israel, you'll be blessed? Have you seen that in your life, in your church?
Well, I think without question, that is true. And I think, the coalition to support the Jewish people or Israel, many components, some of it is, you're right, it's about the democracy and the distinctiveness of that in the region. Some, it's a biblical orientation. And Genesis 12 is certainly a key component of that. It's probably more fundamental to me at this point. In Paul said in Romans that without the Jewish people, we have no law, we have no scripture, we have no prophets, we would have no Messiah, we have no story, we have no access to the covenants of God. I have no faith. I didn't arrive with something new. I'm standing on the shoulders of generations of people who have suffered greatly to have been called by God. And while I recognize the differences, and I'm not trying to diminish those, I consider it a great honor to be included in the stream of that narrative. And there's no question God has blessed me, but what I've learned from my Jewish friends is there's a price that is exacted for being chosen. And while I don't understand that in the way that you would, I understand in the 21st century, there's still a price to be paid if you consider to imagine yourself to be the people of God in the earth. And if you're willing to pay it to defend your homes and defend your children and to send all of your children into the army when they finish school, then I should at least be willing to stand up on your behalf with the places and the platforms God has given me. And yes, he blesses us. And yes, our adversaries are persistent and unrelenting. But why should I be surprised at that? That's been true since the beginning of the book.
What do you think that Jews and Israelis just don't understand or know about your community? Like, what are we missing?
I was in the hotel in Jerusalem a few years ago for Sukkot, and I was in the lobby. My wife and I were sitting in the lobby, and an American Jewish couple came up and started asking us questions just about Christians, and it was clear they didn't have much awareness. And another couple, they were visiting, American Jews were visiting, and they came up and they started asking us questions. And the first couple turned and said, "We found this one, you go get your own." And what I have come to understand from the university and different places is our communities are too isolated. And probably the simplest way for me to understand that is with the Black and the white community here at home. There are people in power who benefit from us staying isolated, or there are institutions that benefit if they can keep us separate. But there is real strength when we can sit together and have honest dialogue. And so I think a conversation like this is so profound. I understand there are hurts within the Jewish community that have been initiated by Christians that I can never fully understand. And the depth of that is real. But I also understand there's racism on both sides of the discussion. And the more that we can have honest dialogue and have conversation, the greater the chance that we can find those places where we truly can agree and work together so that we're all in a better place. And I just think it's that lack of awareness. When I tell my friends here that the average Israeli on the street is more comfortable with a Muslim than a Christian, they think I have misspoken. And I have to stop and explain the history of anti-Semitism that's been fostered by the Christian community. And when I explain it, I typically then have to go give them some historical references because they don't really believe me at first. But as we continue to have the dialogue and let that grow forward, I'm amazed at what happens and the strength that comes from it. So I thank you for your willingness to sponsor something like this, because I'm sure not everybody applauds you for doing it.
No, just
But
wait.
I believe it's worthwhile.
This is going to come out and I'm going to have to hide for a while.
The truth is, I was telling Zvika, the way we started this idea and concept for the podcast is that so many Jews after October 7th, for the first time, actually, maybe ever, I think relations have been warming since my father started the fellowship 40 years ago. There's been significant warming of the
Absolutely.
relationship.
Absolutely.
And Jews understanding the Christian community isn't trying to kill us, isn't trying to convert us, wants to love us and reach their hand out. And it's about time after 40 years and so much proof. Kind of the proof is in the pudding that you see. They've stood with us through thick and thin. It's time that the Jewish community reach our hand back in return. And we started to see that really happening. But after October 7th, when the Jewish community saw so many other communities that they've invested in globally in a second turn their backs on Israel and give into the anti-Semitism. And the only community that didn't turn their backs on Israel was the larger evangelical community. Suddenly, the Jewish people now want to understand it. They want to hear it. They want to hear all the different parts. And for the first time, I think, have a real open heart to listen. And so I think this podcast is going to be life-changing for a lot of people. It gives so many thoughts that the community as a whole and individuals will have to process and find their own narrative and answers to. But Pastor Alan, you have been so inspiring, enlightening for everything that you've provided us today with, and just your lifelong dedication to Israel in such a humble way, in such an educated way, in such a passionate way. I think the Jewish people have so much that you've done that we should and are saying thank you for. So thank you, Pastor Alan.
Well, you are welcome. It's an honor to consider you a friend. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for doing what you do.
God bless you both.
Thank you so much for joining us in this podcast series, Christian Friends of Israel and Is It Good for the Jews? I know that you must have a lot of thoughts, and I hope that we're providing lots of answers. And if you want to be engaged further with me and Zvika, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and of course you can visit our websites at jpost.com and ifcj.org. This is one of the most important relationships that we see growing. This is good for Christians, this is good for Jews, and this is good for the world. For the first time in history, the Jewish people have friends. And I hope that you understand this friendship a little bit deeper because of this series. Thank you so much for joining me and Zvika. And if you enjoyed it, make sure to share it with your friends. We have to get the word out. More people have to understand evangelical Christian Zionists, why they stand with Israel, and why this is so important. So share it with a friend, share it with your family, and we look forward to being in touch with you.